Welcome to the High Performance Best Practices for Websites session today. My name is Jason Weber. I'm a lead program manager on the Internet Explorer team at Microsoft, and my focus is performance. How many of you were in the keynote this morning? Almost everyone. How many of you saw the work that we're doing today? It was announced this morning around hardware-enabled HTML5. A lot of hands there. A lot of excitement throughout the day in that space. Now, today, we're gonna cover two things in this session. The first is really best practices for improving your performance for your websites today. And we're going to do that by looking at really three things. We're going to start by looking at taking an inside look at the browser. We're going to look at the subsystems that make up the browser and really look at how the browser operates. From that, we're going to look at 20 best practices that you can use today, 20 very specific things that you can go back and apply to your sites today that are going to improve performance of your websites across all browsers. Now, of course, I work on the Internet Explorer team, and I have a deep understanding of Internet Explorer. But the practices that we'll be looking at today apply to all browsers. Many of the practices that we'll be walking through are discussed broadly on the Internet. And one of my goals today is not just to show you the practice, but give you a better understanding of the principles behind the practice so that you can apply those principles in everything that you do. The second half of this session, we're going to look at, or give you a preview of Internet Explorer 9 and the performance characteristics that are changing. This goes back to the hardware-accelerated HTML5 that you saw during the keynote that I just mentioned. And hardware-accelerated HTML5 is really enabled by two different things. The first is GPU-powered graphics, and the second is compiled JavaScript. And we'll go deep into that in the second half of the session. So let's go ahead and get started with the first piece, best practices that you can use today. And I wanted to start with the disclaimer, which is I have a lot of content. When we were preparing for MIX, all the presenters received an email, and one of the comments in the email recommended that presenters keep their presentations to about 20, 25 slides. I have to warn you that I actually have, I think, 95 or 100 slides. That's because I want to show a lot of code samples. I want to show a lot of pictures. I want to give you guys not just a bulleted list of things to do, but I want to actually show you the best practices in action so that you can take those back. My presentation will be linked on the MIX website next to the video, so you can go download the presentation later. You can actually play with these best practices yourselves. You don't have to worry about taking notes across all 95 slides today. Now, as we start talking about best practices, I thought I'd start with a scenario. And the scenario I chose is loading a news website. And I picked the Wall Street Journal. We could have picked any of a large number of different news websites, or I'm guessing many of the websites that you have today exhibit the same performance characteristics as these news sites. But I picked the Wall Street Journal. And here we are on Bing.com. And what we're going to do is we're going to navigate in the address bar to the Wall Street Journal. And the experience that your customers have today for many web properties, and really what your as web developers are trying to optimize is this loading experience. In the Wall Street Journal's case, the thing that you see is it kind of first flashes to black. The HTML has come in. We know the background color. The browser is able to kind of erase the screen and paint it to black. And as additional information comes in, we're able to progressively display more and more information. The initial HTML comes in with some text. A couple of images were pulled from the cache. The headers start to appear as more style information comes into the page. The initial content will appear. After a split second, the right column starts to appear. The right column, in this case, is actually programmatically composed from JavaScript and is injected into the page. Additional content, such as media, trickles in over time. And as the media came in, you'll notice it actually caused the content shift down. It caused the page to shift down a little bit. Customized content on a per user or per locale basis comes in. In this case, stock quotes, as well as some local content. And finally, advertisements appear. Now, once the web page is loaded, customers interact with the page. They might start playing the video. They might actually toggle through the different headlines. as well as the page is going to interact with the customer. It's going to change the advertisement. It's going to update the stock quotes. It's going to update the headlines. This is the performance scenario or this is usually what, when your customers talk about performance, this is an example scenario of what they're referring to. Now, I picked the Wall Street Journal, but I didn't necessarily want to go, and show you the underlying characteristics of the Wall Street Journal. I wanted to do that across a few different news sites and give them a little bit of anonymity. So here you'll see 10 different news sites on the left. And what I've done is I picked 5 of these, and I spent a bunch of time profiling those news sites. And I'm going to call those news site number 1 through number 5. The last thing I want is a newspaper or a reporter upset with me for picking on their site. So I have news sites number 1 through 5, and we're going to look at these in a little bit of depth here. Here are some of the characteristics of those news sites that I picked. Again, these are some of the top web properties in the world. And you'll see that if we look through the columns left to right, the left column is the total size in kilobytes of content that's being downloaded from that news site. The next is the number of HTML elements that are in the kind of the page at the end result of the page. We then have the total number of CSS rules that are brought down and being applied to the page. The number of images, the number of script files, the total number of lines of script in the page, and then last is the script libraries that page uses. Many of them use standard libraries such as jQuery or Prototype or YUI, the Yahoo UI library. Others have their own custom script libraries. Now, let's look at some of the kind of interesting variations that occur across these sites. If we just start with the total size, you'll see that news site 1 is 10 times larger than news site number 3. 3 megabytes compared to 300 kilobytes of content. That's very significant for 5 websites that are really producing the same type of experience to customers. If we go and look at, for example, the number of elements to the number of CSS rules, you'll see that news site number 1 has 8,600 elements for only 1,300 rules. So about 6 elements for every single rule. Whereas news site number 2 has 820 elements for close to 3,000 rules. So architecturally, they have the complete opposite architectures in place just in terms of elements and rules. If we go on to image files, you'll see that news site number 1 has 137 images, whereas news site number 2 has only 26. So very significant differences. If we look at the amount of script, news site number 2 has only less than a quarter of the amount of script of news site number 5. And then finally, news site number 4 links in a whole bunch of different JavaScript frameworks. News site number 2 doesn't. Again, news site number 2 only has 3,800 lines of script, and they've optimized that script. So based on the information you've seen today, what site do you think loads the fastest, provides the fastest page load time? 2? I've heard 3 or 4 2s, a couple 3s. It's actually site number 3. And we'll talk about why as we go through the best practices section of the presentation. Now, I have to ask the opposite question. Which site loads the slowest? 1, 5, 4, 5, 3? I've heard a lot of 1s and a lot of 5s. It's actually site number 4, which at first might be surprising because you'll notice site number 4 has half the total content that comes down compared to site number 1 and site number 5. It has half the JavaScript. The smallest number of CSS rules across any of these sites. And the reason for this is that site number 4 doesn't really follow any of the best practices or many of the best practices that we're going to talk about today. This is actually a view on the page load times broken out by the subsystem timings inside Internet Explorer. I think as many of you know, and as was discussed in the keynote today, performance is a multidimensional problem. Internet Explorer is composed of 10 or 11 different subsystems that we're going to talk about today. And you can see where the time is spent. Of course, if you look in red, that's the amount of time spent in the JavaScript engine.